Good morning, Ways and Means. It is Wednesday, April 29th. It is 9 a.m. We are receiving an update on the cannabis market because we are going to receive a cannabis bill from House Government Operations that has passed the Senate already. And we have time this week and we might not have time next week when it actually arrives. And so going to ask people to retain the information that we hear this morning until next week in our brains. Is everyone going to commit to that awesome task? Great. Thanks. Ted, you're up.
Good morning.
Morning.
Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal Office. Great. Okay, so I am going to run through a overview of cannabis excise and sales taxes and their allocations. This is mostly a review of the general state of the world, but we are going to talk a little bit about trends and kind of the overall status of the market, at least from what we're seeing in terms of tax revenue collection. So starting off very high level, there are two taxes on retail cannabis transactions: the 14% cannabis excise, which is allocated 70% to the general fund, 30% to the substance misuse prevention fund. The 6% sales tax, which is 100% allocated to the universal after school and summer special fund. Key point here is the 1% local option tax. If it is a local option sales tax, applies to cannabis in this communities that have adopted a local option sales tax and also have have voted to allow retailers with the municipal borders. So that's a combined rate of 20% without the 1% local option. Sales to medical patients or caregivers are exempt from those taxes. In an effort to provide increased access to the medical market, Act 166 of 2025 created something called a medical endorsement, which allows retail establishments to sell to medical patients, and that those transactions will be tax-free. And 28, last time I checked, 28 of 110 retailers have adopted this medical endorsement. And data has shown that once the adult use market came online, there was a decline in the number of medical patients that has started to return once with this increase in access at retailers. Vermont has chosen a percentage tax on retail transactions. We'll note this is not the only way to do it. For states that only have taxes on retail sales, the rates vary quite substantially. Missouri has a 6% tax on retail, but it ranges all the way up to 37% in Washington. Some states like Connecticut have a tax on THC potency. So generally, the stronger the product, the higher tax rate on those products. And then there are also a number of states that have either a wholesale excise tax or a combination of a retail tax and a wholesale level tax. So in Maine, they just increased their retail tax rate from 10 to 14%, but they also tax plants at the wholesale level. So for, if someone gives an immature plant to someone else within the market, they pay $100 or $1 at that wholesale level. The rates are much higher for more finished products. Flour is $223 per pound. And so it scales based on kind of how finished the product is at the wholesale level, at least in Maine. So on the right-hand side, this is a table that shows the overall trajectory of collections in both the sales and excise tax. So we've In fiscal year 26, the consensus revenue forecast put the excise tax at $22.6 million, and this implies that the sales tax would generate just shy of $10 million this fiscal year. A key point here is I hear a lot of times there is an expectation, I think, that the market is much larger than it actually is, and so the tax capacity is much larger than it actually is.
There was a really fun VPR piece last summer, maybe, where, did everyone else hear this? It was, someone had called in and said, like, why can't you fix the education fund with cannabis revenue? And they did like an entire piece about how much you can't fix the education fund with cannabis revenue.
That's similar to the lottery.
It is,
I
the
get
same
that all
question,
the
yes,
time.
yes.
Yeah, why,
Yes.
all the lottery money goes there, why do you have to spend so much on school?
Yes, so I certainly noticed an increase in questions about cannabis after town meeting. Absolutely. So this implies, so the $22.6 million, since the 14% tax on retail transactions, if you back that out to get the size of the base, it's a little more than 160 million estimated for fiscal year 26. And so, right, to generate ed fund savings amount of you would have to have unprecedented tax rates on cannabis. So there are this $161 million of market size is, 78 towns have at least one cannabis retailer. Folks have to opt in to the cannabis market in a municipality. So it's not available everywhere, and you see in the market, and Chair Pepper can certainly talk about market structure and geographic distribution of retailers, right? There are clustering of retailers in places that have adopted cannabis in their towns. And so, I think there's also questions of why does certain, like why does Burlington have quite a few retailers? Why does, Rutland? And it's because they're servicing a much larger geographic area than necessarily strictly local markets.
This might be later in your presentation or in the board's presentation, but you're going to go into how much of the money that's going into the universal after school or the substance misuse special fund is getting used.
Absolutely, yeah, it's later. Yep. Talking in general trends, early in the market, unsurprisingly, as the market was adding additional retailers, the adult use market first collected substantial. We saw the market open in October 22, start seeing tax revenues in November of 22, month over month, seeing substantial increases in the early years of the market. And then more recently, we've seen a leveling off of tax revenue collections, implying that the market is at some stage of maturity. You'll see oscillations. There's a dip. The cannabis market and tax revenues are to some extent correlated with tourism seasons. And so you can see right here around March, close to our mud season, right, a little bit of a dip, but we're seeing more oscillation month to month. And, absent any major changes, can expect that, hopefully things continue to hum along at this rate. Folks, when I've done this in other committees, asked about this spike in August of 25. As far as I can tell, it's not connected to anything. It might just be the data we're using the daily revenue summaries from the Department of Taxes, and it might be like a month-end processing thing as opposed to anything that was happening on the ground in terms of sales.
It's just been a really nice day.
Really? Yeah, exactly. Certainly. The revenue forecasts in January 26 were in looking forward to 28 and 29 shows tax revenue collections growing at 4 and a little more than 4 and a little more than 3% in fiscal years 28 and 29 respectively. So that's in line with more of an inflationary growth amount in line with retail sales, kind of the base staying relatively level. Yes. So this is showing the price per gram for cannabis in Massachusetts. They started off with a price per gram a little bit above $14. They started right after or right before the pandemic. So there's this blip in the pandemic where it's a drop in price and then it recovered. And then after let's see, this is about a year and change of operation in the market. The price per gram went down considerably and has continued to decrease all the way down to $4 per gram currently. And I put this on here because Massachusetts has a few extra years of experience, let's say, than Vermont does in terms of their market. And this is reflective of what's happened in other states, right? Initially a high price. As growers move into the market and supply increases, the price of cannabis has fallen in those states. I did a very unscientific and unrepresentative survey of retailers online yesterday. The lowest price I was able to see per gram is more in the $7 range. Chair Pepper can certainly, I don't know, might have more detail on prices. There has been policy work, and the board will temporarily close certain licensing types in an effort to manage supply, right? The real risk in an adult use cannabis market is you have a flood of supply that decrease prices, and that obviously will have an impact on tax collection since the tax is on retail collections. So open question of whether, Vermont has more room in the floor, but for the floor and price. But yeah, we'll note that there is a lot of attention being paid to make sure that supply and demand in the market is matched. Representative Wozniak, this is where we start getting into where certain special funds are receiving cannabis revenue and the breakdowns now projected for this fiscal year and in future fiscal years. The Substance Misuse Prevention Fund, which receives 30% under current law of cannabis excise tax revenues for fiscal year 26, is expected to get almost $6.8 million, and then increase a little bit to about $7 million in fiscal year 27. This is administered by the Department of Health. So yes, this money is certainly being used. I could provide more detail into the various uses. Right now, I just have kind of a special fund look. And yes, there is kind of the Substance Misuse Prevention Fund. There's also been conversations this year about using it for recovery centers and pairing it together with opioid funds. So that's part of the conversation here. The cannabis excise tax has had a long and convoluted history of allocation, reallocation, redirection. And so this is a review of the basic mechanics of that. Historically, in fiscal year 23, 100% of the revenue was in the general fund. And then in 24 and 25, the 100% of the revenue went to the Cannabis Regulation Fund, which supports the operations of the Cannabis Control Board. After, in those two fiscal years, the remainder after control board expenses was then transferred to the general fund and substance misuse in the traditional 70-30 split. And then in fiscal year 26, that's when started the current structure of the excise tax revenue going to the general fund and then to the substance misuse prevention fund.
Yes, concerning the misuse prevention fund, do we actually spend all of the monies that go into that fund for misuse and prevention, addiction issues and that sort of thing?
Yes, it is my understanding that we do. I can provide more context into the specific. Yeah. Mhm.
Sorry, just curiosity. 70-30 why was it 70-30?
60-40?
That's my question.
I don't know the decision as to why that split occurred. Yeah, it's certainly, yeah, I don't know.
I think it's really what Representative Kimball said. There was a pretty significant debate when the legislation first passed about how much should go into prevention and how much should become just the general revenues of the state in order for people to feel comfortable.
Yeah, no, I was just more observing that it was the same structure that local option tax was at the time. So I was just.
Oh, gosh, no.
I was just, yeah, I was just, I mean, that was also 70-30, and I was just curious.
Five 25. Mere accident.
Because this is entirely a joke, because 70-30 felt too comfortable, and we were, so Senate Appropriations recommended a change to allocations of cannabis excise tax revenue. Instead of the 70-30 split, starting in fiscal year 28, 20% of cannabis excise tax revenue would go to the Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. In this table here, it shows that in fiscal years 28 and 29, that would be about $5 million. The budget, as recommended by Senate Appropriations, would also make free appropriations one time from the fund, $12 million for a multi-purpose center project with UVM, Freedom and Unity grant at BSAC, and for a housing transformation project at Vermont State College to Johnson. The Higher Ed Trust Fund had approximately $5.7 million at the end of fiscal year 25. There was a large amount of excise tax revenue that ended there, which I think you all discussed before. Kind of a windfall in tax revenue. And so, yes, there's this last bullet provides context on how the statutory uses of the Higher Ed Trust Fund, but wanted to mainly flag that they're proposing this change of 20% excise tax revenue going to a new use, the Higher Ed Trust Fund.
Which is not going to come to this committee. The piece of legislation that will come to this committee is the cannabis bill that's currently in GovOps. This will likely go to the Appropriations Committee of Conference, the Budget Committee of Conference. So everyone's perfectly welcome to have an opinion. Yes, Representative Maslin, but that does not necessarily need to be voiced in this moment either. Right, floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. This seems reasonable. I understand the logic. I can follow that. There is a notion out and about you, some of the higher education fund, whatever, for a sports arena, Burlington. And just for the record, to those around this table, I'm not at all in favor of that whatsoever. So help me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We will not actually have an opportunity to formally weigh in on this proposal. I don't.
Understood. I just
think. We'll all get to know before, right?
It was recognized here.
Absolutely, yes. And I believe the House's official position is to not spend this money. Yes.
Sure, I'm gonna move right along.
Thanks so much, Ted.
Mostly a public service announcement. Moving on to the sales tax.
Thanks so much, Ted.
So yes, our 6% sales tax, 100% goes to the Universal After School and Summer Special Fund, created in the budget adjustment in 2024. Previously, that sales tax revenue went to the education fund. The special fund was created so that the sales tax money could go to after school programs that were provided outside of school districts. So the Agency of Education administers a grant program with those revenues. With how the Agency of Education administers the grant program, they choose a cohort of grant awardees, and that cohort receives funding over multiple fiscal years. The programs receive funding for 3.5 years, and then centers receive funding for 5 years. And so that will scale out the amount of units being spent out of the special fund. The cohort in fiscal year 25 was awarded 2.4 million. And so combined with the cohort in fiscal year 24, the first year, and then in 25, there's 10.5 million in funding is allocated in fiscal year 2030. They are ramping up spending through the special fund. There is more revenue that's going into the special fund than is currently being spent, but they're catching up by doing this multi-year award and cohort kind of grant funding. And if you were more curious about the grant program and expenditures and how they're looking at awarding those grants, I would absolutely defer to the Agency of Education. And then finally, there are fees on cultivators, manufacturers, retailers, et cetera. They raise about $2.5 million per year. The budget request from the control board in fiscal year 27 is about $7.1 million. And inevitably, when we talk about fees for the control board, there's a question of, were the fees designed, should they be designed to support the full operations of the control board? And Act 62, which tasked folks with developing a fee schedule, noted that the fee schedule should include an amount to repay the general fund for excise taxes and cannabis regulation fund. But at the same time, we'll note that the General Assembly included intent language to produce participation in the market by smaller establishments. And ultimately, the fee schedule is designed to encourage smaller establishments. It's scaled so that larger establishments are paying a larger amount in fees and really advantaging smaller growers in Vermont's market. And noting that if the policy goal was to fully pay for the expenses of the board, fees would have to be increased rather substantially. And so it'd be, I think, quite hard to get to there.
And when we set the taxes and fees the first time, there was like really remarkably extensive testimony and conversation about price elasticity and what it would actually mean to set prices and fees at a level that the market would function in a substantive way, because the goal was to create a legal market, given how extensive our gray market was at the time, and probably still is, frankly, but yeah.
So does the CCB's budget come out of the excise tax or the sales tax, or both? Where does it come right off the top of the total amount?
No, so it is coming out of, so in addition to fees, they have a B section in the budget, and the balance between their $7.1 million budget request and the $2.5 million in fee is paid for through general fund. Some folks will make the connection that excise tax is going into the general fund, and then general fund is paying for the control board and pulling a link, but really the general fund is the general fund. It's fungible. So the control board they receive it's about $4.6 million in general funds in the FY27 budget as it currently stands.
And wasn't there also a new facility to test marijuana above and beyond tech center? Is that all inclusive in that budget, or is that something that's in the capital bill, or where did that money come from?
Pepper can cover that when he comes up.
So, okay.
Pepper can answer that.
And that's it on my end. I wanted to flag 2 resources. We have a new type of document called Fast Facts.
Oh,
I know. So it's 1 to 2 page, 1 to 2 page document on kind of the frequent. It's like an FAQ. It's intended to answer questions that we get quite a bit in a short, really accessible format. let's see, there's cannabis excise tax. I think there is one on the higher ed trust fund, but yeah, there's 5 of them. They're a new document type there on the JFO website. Absolutely encourage looking at those. And we are trying to figure out which topics we'll cover through Fast Facts in the fall. And then we also have a cannabis revenue tracker on the JFO website. So every month we update the amount of sales and excise tax that has come in for the previous month. And show, I can actually pull this up really quickly. Let's see how well that works. It does, and then it shows. Oh, nuts. It totally worked on my screen. I'm gonna share again. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm married to a school teacher, which is why I say things like nuts and noodles. So that's right. So yeah, it just shows, it kind of shows where we are. It shows where we are compared to the previous year and as a reminder of allocations of cannabis excise tax and sales tax revenue. So it's if you're ever curious about how tax revenues are doing this far in the fiscal year, you can check that out on the JFO website.
And this is the fact that you started doing it. This is like a micro level of revenue to have a tracker for, and it's because you got so very many requests that you were like, it'll actually save time for me to create this thing.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep.
Do we know where these sales are? Track a lot of information, but can you see where the greatest sales are, which communities are doing better than others?
I could probably, I don't necessarily track that information. I could ask the Department of Taxes because they manage the data for these 2 revenue sources. I could ask them to see if they have a municipal breakdown. Yeah, no, it would be interesting. I imagine you would see some of that clustering around where retailers are. Sure, where the greatest density of retailers are for sure. But I would be curious to see, if there is certain retailers in certain geographic locations are, have more robust business, per retailer compared to others. So yeah, no.
And at times too, it would be interesting to see how it coordinates with certain occasions and events, things like that.
Indeed.
So.
Yeah, a lot of retail.
Yeah, Madam Chair. Ted, do you have a detailed sheet on the fees, on the 2.5 million? Specifically what fees and how much each of them is bringing in?
I do, and I can,
I'd like
yes, share it with you all.
Right. Pepper might cover that to some degree. Yeah.
This is more, I think, for you, Madam Chair, than Ted. I'd be interested in the after school and summer special fund. I don't necessarily want to take testimony time with that, but curious if like a memo can come from AOE as to what the uses of that are and where that money is going.
And do you have that somewhere?
There is a great, I will share the link with Sorsha. There is a great after school report from the Agency of Education that's talking about both the after school and summer special fund and 21C funding and how those 2 work together within the entire after school list.
Great, yeah, that was actually where I was going, so thank you for that. And then for you, Madam Chair, just curious, I'm trying to have the stadium debate, but do we have jurisdiction over, so we have jurisdiction over levying these taxes? Do we have jurisdiction over how,
Money is spent?
how those percentages work?
Not really. No, that's appropriations,
Interesting.
sort of. Because that's actually covering for a lost tax to some degree.
Oh, all right.
Because the pilot fund is about
Right.
payment in lieu of payment. Sometimes when a tax is set up, we do that part, but the overall.
Yeah, that's just a personal curiosity, but.
But mostly if that all happened earlier in the session, rather than something that would happen in the committee of conference, it might flow through, but given that's just going to be committee of conference fodder, we do not.
Input rather than authority.
Indeed, there you go, input rather than authority. Anything else for Ted before we hear from Pepper? Thanks, Ted.
Sure thing.
See you later.
Yeah.
I just know he has to leave and usually he would stay for the second half of the testimony. That's all I meant.
I actually have a little, I'll hang out for a little bit.
Okay. cool.
You deserve it, Tim.
Hey, good morning.
Right.
Thank you for having me. My name is James Pepper. I'm the chair of the Cannabis Control Board. This is one of my favorite times of year to come to this committee. And, you know, most times I start talking about cannabis, people start running the other way, but I have a captive audience for the next hour and a half. So I'll try not to use the whole time. So I guess maybe I'll just start with answering a few of the questions that I heard in the initial. I have a presentation. The slides are on your website. On what the fees are bringing in, you asked for a report last year that I submitted, I think in November or December of 2025. That breaks out all the fees that are coming in by categories. That is posted on your website as well. So, and it's in the appendix. So it's just kind of a fee table showing all the various fees and what they're bringing in. So, yeah. We do a lot of market analysis to make sure that we're properly kind of meeting that supply and demand. And so we are looking at sales regularly. So there's another report that breaks out sales by product category, by county, that's also on your website. And I've got a few slides on that as well. And then on the lab expenses are now fully baked into our budget. So the 7.1 includes all the lab expenditures. So as long as there aren't dramatic shifts to the market, I think that 7.1, just with the kind of standard inflations, will be pretty much our operating expenses moving forward. We're not anticipating any huge new costs absent some dramatic shift in the market. And I know that 7.1, you know, a lot of people say, did anyone know it was going to cost that much money to regulate this industry when we started? No one really knew what the entrepreneurial interest in becoming a cannabis business was going to be, how many licensees we were going to have. So we started with 2 employees, and we're now up to 28. I don't want me to sound defensive, but you know, we have analyzed a number of other states, most of the New England states, as to what the appropriate number of FTEs to licensees is to effectively manage. And we operate a very lean agency compared to every other cannabis regulatory agency. Just by way of example, New Jersey has 1 FTE for every 3 licensees. Massachusetts has 1 for every 5. So 1 full-time employee for every 5 licensed business. Maine has 1 for every 7. And we have 1 for every 20. So, you know, we are a scrappy agency that gets by, but we are certainly, I think the 7 million is a big number and 28 employees is a big agency, but relatively speaking. But I think, you know, it's in line, maybe on the outer edge of some of our other partners in cannabis regulation.
James, how does that break down for revenue per employee, revenue for the?
You know, I feel like you asked me that at one time and I actually didn't look that up. I apologize.
Yeah, we probably ask the same questions every time.
No, but I should have anticipated that. I apologize. You know, our revenue is coming in significantly higher than what JFO anticipated in FY23 when we had a few months of sales under our belts and they kind of projected out a few years. And I've got a slide just on that as well. So let me, if it's all right with the chair, maybe I can share my screen.
Consistent with our questions.
Yes. Is that showing?
Yes.
All right. So, this is just what I have on the agenda. Of course, stop me at any time, if anyone has questions. I know this kind of generates a lot of questions, this topic. So a general market overview, this is just the number of active licensees that we have over kind of a 12, 14-month period. You can see a spike in kind of February, March of 2025. That's the time where we voted as a board to close issuing new cultivation and retail licensees. We always give the market at least 30 days notice when we make one of those decisions for people that may be midway through the application process or haven't hit submit on their application yet, but have actively started building out the retail or cultivation facility, just to give them some notice they need to get that application through the door. And as expected, a lot of people rushed through the door right around the time we voted to close those application windows. And so we saw this somewhat artificial spike. It's now leveling off to a more kind of standard. These are just the number of licensees broken out by type. You can see that cultivators are the majority of our 562 licensees. We also have, 92 manufacturers, 110 retailers. Amongst the cultivators, these are the retail locations by county. I thought I had a slide.
Will you go back to the thing?
Which one? This one?
The map.
Yeah. So,
So we also have a desert situation on it.
right, yes, yeah. And I think you gave us some authority over retail siting 2 years ago. Initially, we had no authority over where retail locations could go. There was an opt-in, opt-out provision, so we are seeing clustering in places that have opted in. But as far as within the actual kind of municipality or more broadly, we had no authority to say, it can't be within 1,000 feet of the childcare center, park, arcade. That was all thought to be a local decision, but the market kind of took off before the towns, I think, had a real opportunity to catch up and pass ordinances that would have limited the clustering. So that's just, but when we have we've closed issuing new retail licenses, there's no retail licenses, new ones being issued. And when they try to move, we have some retail siting guidelines where they can't go to densely populated areas. If you're going to move out of Burlington, for instance, where there's 11, you have to go to a part of the state that's less densely packed with retailers. Yeah.
So when you had a rush, when you stop issuing retail licenses.
Yes.
Are those people still coming on board or are they all finished?
They're all finished. Yeah, we have, you have to have your license complete before, you have to have your facility complete before we issue the license. And we don't let applications linger for longer than 90 days. So this is a breakdown of our licensees by status. The legislature, the 2020 legislature wanted to create a category of licensees called social equity. Essentially, when you're launching a new market for a product that was formerly illegal, the legislature wanted to acknowledge that there's a lot of people that, because of past criminal histories with cannabis, would probably not be able to get a bank loan or be able to participate in this market. So there was some priority status given to people that have been historically harmed by cannabis prohibition. And they represent about 15% of the market. There's a secondary class called economic empowerment. These are like veteran-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, First American-owned businesses, just folks that haven't necessarily been harmed by cannabis prohibition, but are given a little bit of priority status in that initial rollout of licensure when we had it back. What for some reason, I'm missing a slide here, but I did want to note that of our cultivators, 345 cultivators, 254 or 74% are tier 1 cultivators. They're growing on 1,000 square feet or less. And they really are driving the ingenuity of this market. These are very often former illicit market growers, the gray market growers or black market growers that have decided to kind of take a leap of faith and get a license. And they brought a lot of their genetics that they've been cultivating for decades into the market with them. And it really makes our market unique compared to all of our New England states. Just by way of example, Connecticut for the first 3 or 4 years, their market only had 4 cultivation, like mega farms, supplying all of the cannabis for the state. We have 345 cultivators. And another unique feature of our market is before any product actually hits the market, goes to the retail shelf, it has to be registered with the Cannabis Control Board. And we look for compliance with all of our testing requirements, our packaging, labeling, advertising. And this is just a snapshot of the number of products that we have, over 5,000 unique products. The vast majority of those are flower, individual strains of flower, pre-rolls, but we have, vape cartridges, edibles, concentrates, tinctures. There's some more data about, I actually have it on the next slide, about sales. This is just a snapshot, like a little over a 2-year snapshot of sales, just giving you an idea of what people are purchasing. Flower, is the most popular by a long shot. And then I've got some information on the total spending.
What infuses a pre-roll or a flower?
Infused pre-rolled flower. So that would be just a typical joint that has some kind of addition to it, like terpenes or THC.
It's not like rose petals.
No. The only additives that we allow are ones that are generally regarded as safe by the FDA or that are naturally occurring in the cannabis plant.
Okay. And then vape cartridges, I'm very old fashioned, so I don't understand how vapes work. Do you all you're regulating the cartridges, but like all of the fancy delivery mechanisms, are those
We don't do the,
tapes, the Hello Kitty, whatever? How does that all work?
unfortunately, we don't have jurisdiction over the devices themselves.
Device, that's the word, thank you.
And they are causing problems both in the nicotine and the cannabis. It's a kind of the frontier of where the problems are. You're seeing leaching, and cannabis actually has to be heated to a higher level, higher temperature than tobacco. So it increases the possibility of cracking and leaching of those components within especially the cheap.
Like the plastic leaching? Is that what you mean by
Like the
leaching?
coils
Uh-huh.
that are actually heating it, that are making contact with the oil. Sometimes when those get heated up to a high temperature, especially when it's cold out, they can break. And then, there's cadmium or nickel or lead in
Okay.
those that leach into the oil.
Oh. What are the different temperatures?
I think it's around 400 degrees for THC, and I don't know what it is for tobacco, but it is lower. Yeah.
Representative Maslin?
Actually, James, you answered the question.
Oh,
Problems with devices.
okay, yeah.
Then what's that?
Can you just go back to the last slide quickly? What in the chart on the left, well, actually, I have the chart. What are the numbers showing? Is that like types of? Like types, or sorry. On the charts, the tables in the top, what do the numbers indicate? Like types, for example, flower 2687. Is that the types of flower, units sold?
Oh, no, that's a registered product, so unique
Okay.
registration.
Unique registration.
Yes.
Okay. No.
The products on the market, basically.
Right.
So something could have come on the market, could have been approved in 2024 and then not sold in 2025.
Annual registration, yeah, so,
Thanks.
yeah.
This is flower, it's a different strain.
Each unique strain has to be done different, registered differently, because it's gonna have a different potency, different certificate of analysis.
And a strain sold as a flower versus a strain sold as a pre-roll would be 2 separate products.
I believe so, yeah.
It doesn't matter. Sorry.
That's an
I just read
incredible
this.
number. That's nice. Yeah.
It's really what makes Vermont a craft market. It's highly competitive, but it is a very craft market. And if there is federal legalization, it's very likely that we will be a net exporter of cannabis products, I would imagine. But we'll see. This is just, again, just a snapshot of the complaints. We have an anonymous complaint process. This just kind of gives you a sense of what people are seeing out there when they're complaining. The majority of them are for advertising violations, but there's all sorts of issues. The chart, the letters of warning is kind of our first step in the process as far as sanctions. Usually for unintentional violations, we send a letter of warning. We do have graduated sanctions depending on people, whether something was intentional or particularly extreme. So we have letters of warning, we got notices of violation, we got associated penalties.
Hi, so many questions.
Yes.
So if two different scenarios, if they legalize in New Hampshire
Yeah.
and Vermont producers are selling our products in New Hampshire, do we get the excise tax but not the sales tax? And can products cross the border? And similarly, if someone has a cannabis company here, and they're licensing products in Florida, with their Vermont brand, how does that work?
So currently,
Tell us about interstate commerce.
currently interstate commerce is widely believed to be illegal, and that's how it's being interpreted. There are a lot of very well-paid lawyers that argue that interstate cannabis markets, even for illegal products, is a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause. But as it stands right now, no products are allowed to cross state lines. And so if a person wanted, a Vermont manufacturer, cultivator wanted to sell products shouldn't use New Hampshire because they haven't legalized yet. But in Massachusetts, they would have to get a Massachusetts license, set up a facility there, have a separate LLC there, and kind of just establish their own supply chain within the borders of Massachusetts.
Even if it was an interstate school district. I'm sorry.
I don't want to jump ahead. Yes.
And
Yeah.
I fully withdraw my comment. Thank you.
But you mentioned if it's legalized federally, taken off the tier 1 or whatever,
Yes.
and it could be interstate commerce at that point.
It could be, yes. And I think there'll be a very strong push, especially from the western states. They have much lower energy costs and have these huge gluts of cannabis to demand that they have our markets open to their products.
So, but if Vermont becomes this exporter, as you mentioned before, in that legalized market, would we still collect the excise tax on whatever got exported?
So I'll just jump ahead to one of my last slides. What the bill that's coming to you does, a number of those western states have legalized much sooner, much earlier than we did, have authorized their governors to enter into interstate commerce compacts that will address all of the issues that, the health and safety, the product labeling, the testing requirements, the tax, who's collecting the tax, how to do product recalls, how to track these products across states. And the bill that you're going to get eventually has that authorization as well. And it's triggered by, just like the Western states, they have triggering language. Doesn't go in, governor can't just go out and negotiate one of these currently. In fact, he might be committing a conspiracy to commit a federal crime if he did. But it authorizes him, if the Department of Justice deschedules cannabis, or they release a memo very similar to what authorizes us to have a legal cannabis market now, if they publish a new memo saying, we're going to deprioritize for prosecution the interstate commerce between two legal states, or if there's federal legalization. There's a couple of triggering issues that could authorize the governor to enter into one of these interstate compacts.
And that compact would dictate what gets charged and collected for excise and sales taxes.
Exactly.
Okay.
You're talking interstate commerce. What about a consumer that comes from Massachusetts into Vermont, makes a purchase and takes it back? That's not what we're talking about.
Theoretically, there could be enforcement by a federal agent at the border. The likelihood of that happening is pretty low, but we do say on our warning label, I believe, don't cross state lines with this.
And Massachusetts also warns of that.
I just have a few quick slides on the medical program because it often gets overshadowed by the adult use conversation. We still have a medical program in Vermont. In order to qualify for the medical program, you have to have one of these 14 or so qualifying conditions, a doctor who's treated you for at least 3 months and done a physical examination has to sign a form saying that you have one of these conditions. And then you are eligible to become a medical patient. And I oftentimes get asked, why do we still have a medical program? Why can't these folks just shop at the adult use stores? There are certain benefits to being a medical patient that the adult use side of things just is prohibited from offering, or not prohibited in some instances, but we have a mandate that any patient that wants confidentiality for their purchases can have it either through a curbside pickup or specialty hours. That it used to be that at the medical dispensaries, only one patient was allowed in the store at a time. You had to set up a reservation. So anyway, we've maintained that confidentiality for all of the retailers that have one of these medical use endorsements. Patients also have access to specialty products, many of which are prohibited on the adult use side. The higher potency products, higher THC potency products, things like transdermal patches, certain flavored, like we don't allow anything, like we don't allow lollipops, anything that could be confused for candy, but sometimes, you know, medical patients want those. So they can request those. Specialty services, anyone who's any bud tender, they call them, who's interacting with a medical patient has to have a specialized training that's put on and sponsored by the CCB. And I mentioned delivery. You know, medical patients can receive delivery to their house. They have access to caregivers as well. People that can, you know, you can't get out of bed, you can authorize a person to go to a dispensary, purchase cannabis on your behalf and deliver it to you. Access for qualifying minors, you know, adult use cannabis is 21 plus. There are a very small number of people under 21 that are on the medical registry. And you know, anyone under 18 needs consent from their parents. They have medical patients have increased possession limits. They're allowed to purchase 2 ounces in a transaction. And then home cultivation, they're authorized to home cultivate 6 mature and 12 immature plants, whereas a traditional 21 plus household can do 2 and 4. And then, of course, their purchases are not subject to the 16% excise tax or the 6% sales tax. What kind of?
Some of these businesses have a dispensary sign out. Some don't, that's the difference. They're doing the medical.
So what we saw, let's see if I can just find it quickly. Some of my slides, I must have sent the wrong thing, but anyway, we saw a tremendous drop off in the number of patients. First when we did home grow. So, you know, prior to 2018, the only way to access cannabis legally in Vermont was to be a medical patient. So we had about around 5,600 patients at that time. And then we did home grow in 2018 and we legalized possession up to an ounce and gifting up to an ounce. And all of a sudden we saw a drop off of about 2,000 patients. Then we instituted adult use and we saw that number drop down to, I think, below 2,000 patients. And of course, you know, you're talking about having a standalone brick and mortar dispensary that, you know, there were 6 of them at the time, 6 of them in 2018. All of a sudden they started going out of business. So patients had almost zero access to cannabis, to these benefits. And so the legislature responded by creating what's called a medical use endorsement. So an adult use retailer that's in good standing with the board and is subjected to additional regulatory hurdles can seek a medical use endorsement and serve patients. So it's kind of emerging of the adult and medical uses. As long as they can still maintain confidentiality, as long as they can have a point of sale system that can distinguish between medical and adult use sales, and have records of all of the sales for us, to the tax department. And as long as they can kind of meet these enhanced education requirements, they can serve patients.
So again, they have the banner outside that says dispensary.
Yeah.
And the guys that aren't registered for that, no.
For the most part, I mean, sometimes the word dispensary and adult use retailer get interchanged. But the dispensary, when we talk about it, as it's defined in statute, is exclusively for medical patients. And an adult use retailer is the term for a retail licensee.
But someone could put up a sign to feel just sort of like cute and old timey if they want. Okay.
You guys saw all of this with Ted, so I won't go through this. It's just a reminder about how the taxes. And this is that, what I mentioned, I know the numbers are small, but this is that joint revenue forecast from January of 2023. We had, I think, 3 months of adult use sales that JFO was basing these numbers off of. And this is what they projected just the excise tax was going to look like for FY 23, 24, and 25. And then this is the same graph, but updated from January of 26, and you can just see the actuals. We're significantly above where they projected, which, it's their job to give you guys conservative estimates. No one knew how much consumer demands. Vermont has the highest cannabis consumption rates in the country pre-legalization. So there is a big question mark is, cannabis was essentially ubiquitous prior to legalization, and we have home grow. How many of those customers are really going to want to pay a 20% premium for regulated cannabis? And it turns out that we're capturing a decent amount of the market, more so than what was estimated. We are seeing the leveling off that Ted discussed. I think a lot of the motivation around the bill that you might be getting is to capture more of the illicit market, or those people coming from Massachusetts or New Jersey, places that already have adult use, but are coming to Vermont and trying to make sure that they purchase here and not bring their own from home. So things like event licensing, that like you might encourage someone to have a cannabis cash bar at a wedding instead of, bringing their own cannabis from home, purchase it at a festival here or something like that. So despite the kind of strong revenue numbers, there are some very structural challenges that our cannabis industry faces that I just always need to highlight. So we have a structural oversupply problem, and a lot of that is due to the fact that we had a huge number of people get in an outdoor cultivators. We assume because of our climate, we had a number of consultants that looked at the various adult use markets around the country and, look at their climates and how many indoor versus outdoor cultivators they have. And we assumed that it'd be about 20% outdoor, 80% indoor, just because you can grow year round when you're indoor. You can get, between 4 and 6 cycles indoors compared to 1 cycle outdoors. And generally speaking, indoor cannabis fetches a higher price at the market. And so, but we saw pretty much the flip of that initially. We had about 65% of our licensees were outdoor, which is a huge benefit to the environment. Outdoor cultivation is a carbon sequestration. Indoor cannabis cultivation, controlled environment, agriculture, they call it, is absent data centers. The most energy intensive industrial activity on a per square foot basis. And that was information we received from Efficiency Vermont when they were trying to, when they early on structured the market. So, but it does lead to this seasonal oversupply. What you see here is a gray line, which represents the approximate demand for cannabis And then the blue line is the supply. And what you see are these peaks at harvest time. And this is when all of the outdoor cultivators are harvesting their cannabis at the same time. And it leads to this oversupply that hopefully evens out over the course of the year. But it makes the price of cannabis, crash. It's very hard to weather this. And it's just one of those things that our outdoor cultivators are starting to move inside. So we're seeing that trend. They're starting to, change their license types to indoor.
Are they, I think the environmental concerns are really important. And my understanding is one of the other reasons we really wanted to emphasize outdoor cultivation when the market first launched was there's just readier access to it for someone getting off the ground.
Yes. Startup costs or,
Startup costs.
yeah, right.
So when you're seeing that shift to more indoor cultivation, is that folks with sort of established outdoor businesses being able to invest in indoor cultivation, or is it new businesses coming along?
It's not new. We haven't issued a new cultivation license for at least a year now. So yeah, it's mostly people shifting from outdoor to indoor, or from outdoor to, we have this mixed tier. It includes an indoor and outdoor portion.
Oh, thanks. Carol, hi.
Hi, I just wanted to say that I was able to go many years ago, like 9 years ago, to a whole conference, part of a conference on cannabis growing. And before I went to that, I used to think, oh, well, it's farming in a way, and it should be. But anyway, the important thing is that when it's not grown outside, it's actually just grown in buildings. And those buildings create a huge amount of carbon. And they also, they're basically indoor factories. So, I appreciate what you were saying, Chair Kornheiser.
Thanks, Representative Woody. Representative Maslin.
Yeah, thank you very much. When outdoor cultivators move inside, do you have any way of getting energy consumption? Is that anything that you guys are interested in or would track or could track?
We actually do. We historically did ask for that. It's one of the records that we require people to keep. So we could audit it. We initially asked for it to make sure people weren't having illicit grow operations as part of their facility. But it is something that we have access to.
I'm not interested in getting in their faces, but there are people out there who would really like to know.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know how difficult it would be to compile it all, but it's one of those records that we require that people keep for a certain month.
Thank you.
Another challenge is this demand volatility. As we've spoken about, every gram of cannabis sold in Vermont legally has to be grown here, packaged here, tested here. There's a fixed demand for THC or cannabinoids in the state. You can't try to capture more of the illicit market, but even then, there's a fixed demand, and there's this seasonality that Ted discussed. And so the demand for cannabis, Vermont-grown cannabis within the state can grow or decrease depending on a number of factors that are largely outside of the control of our cultivators. So when we first launched, we had about a year and a half where New York had no retail stores. And now the western border is lined with retail stores. So all those consumers that used to travel to Vermont to purchase are now probably staying closer to home. And those retailers are trying to advertise and pull Vermont customers to their stores. And then when, we saw some drop off following the flood of 2023, when, we had some decrease to our tourism numbers there, that impacts all of the kind of seasonally dependent, tourist dependent industries, including cannabis. So it's just really challenging for cannabis cultivators to predict or kind of prepare for. And then there's the illicit market still exists in Vermont. You know, there's some consumers, for a number of reasons that I've got a slide on coming up, that just prefer to stay on the illicit market. And so our regulated cannabis is in competition with that market. And we're not trying to arrest our way out of the illicit market problems. They just kind of operate in parallel. We're trying to outcompete them on the regulated side. And then, so I mentioned the reasons for purchasing on the unregulated market. We recently did some surveying as to why consumers are staying on the illicit market. Number one response was it's cheaper. You know, not only is there a 20% tax increase, there's all the kind of regulatory burden that's baked into the cost of regulated cannabis. More convenient. I won't read all of these, but the product, you can get the products that I want on the illicit market. You know, there's a number of prohibited products on the adult use side. So, you know, we're never going to capture the entire market, but we try and find strategies. I mean, the goal, one of the stated goals in the 2020 bill was to try and shift as many of the cultivators, illicit market operators, and consumers into the regulated space as possible. The other market that we are in competition with, that the cannabis market is in competition with, is the intoxicating hemp market that has emerged over the last, since 2018, mostly through an unintended consequence of the way that the federal government defined hemp. This is relevant because you are also going to have a bill related to hemp products regulation, hemp processor regulation. So it's kind of important that you understand a little bit of this. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background here. So 2018, I mean, we had there's a lot of interest in growing hemp for non-intoxicating purposes, for hemp seed oil, for fiber, hemp concrete, hempcrete, and for CBD. So it's a real thing. It's just there's no real manufacturing supply chain for it. So it is actually, there is promise for it. There's lots of hemp-based bioplastics. It's hard to supplant the plastics industry. It's something new. So the federal government responded by creating a legal fiction between hemp and marijuana for the purposes of the Controlled Substance Act. Marijuana, as it's defined in the Controlled Substance Act, Schedule 1, most highly restrictive, most criminal penalties associated with it. And hemp, which is supposed to have virtually no THC in it, is off the schedule altogether, agricultural product. And this is the definition of hemp that they chose. So you can see it's any part of the cannabis sativa plant, which is the same plant, whether it's marijuana or cannabis, as long as it's below this threshold of THC on a dry weight basis. And all of the derivatives, extracts, and isomers, which comes into play later. So the market for hemp, the hemp oils, the CBD products, was a lot lower than what the hemp processors or the hemp growers thought it was going to be. And so the processors started looking to poke holes in that definition and create effectively cannabis products using hemp and saying that they're hemp. So there's three major loopholes that have been exploited. I say exploited. The hemp people say, well, it's right there in the law. So the 0.3% is virtually nothing in a plant, the 0.3% THC. But when you start talking about a product, all you have to do is increase the weight of the product, and you can pump more and more hemp-derived THC into it and still be below that 0.3% ratio. So this is a candy bar. It says 300 milligrams. You can see right below it. It's 150 milligrams of Delta-9 THC and 150 grams of CBD. So this is a product that would be illegal in the adult use stores if it was grown by a hemp cultivator, because we have a per package limit of 100 milligrams of Delta-9 THC. And yet this product, because it's hemp derived and is, the product itself weighs 50 grams, you can have 150 milligrams of Delta-9 THC.
So you like put nuts in it or something.
Yeah, exactly. Just as long as you increase the weight of the product, we can this is like a serving size manipulation problem. then you can ship this through the mail, you can sell it to kids, no testing, no labeling, no oversight by anyone, and no tax, no excise tax. This is kind of pretty widespread. This other one, this is very technical, but THCA is a precursor to Delta-9 THC. When you ignite THCA, it converts into Delta-9 THC. So this is like, this is a joint. This is a cannabis joint for all intents and purposes. They're saying because the definition of hemp only focused on Delta-9 THC and not THCA, this only converts into a cannabis joint. It's a hemp joint. It only converts into a cannabis joint once it's lit. So, this is like, you can see, it's just, it's Farm Bill compliant. It says it right on the package. This is just this stuff like is very frustrating. And then the derivatives loophole. So, you remember it said all parts of the cannabis plant, including its derivatives, isomers. So you can take CBD, you can wash it in hydrochloric acid and form synthetic Delta-9 THC. And so that's a derivative of the cannabis plant. So it's this.
I see like lots of stuff like this for sale at like gas stations.
Exactly. This is the kind of gas station. These things are like, Oregon, when they started up their state reference lab, just started grabbing as many hemp products out of gas stations as they could and just started testing them and publishing their results. And the results are truly, they're probably what you should expect, but they're all truly horrifying. Pesticides, residual solvents, residual adulterants, just all the stuff, inaccurate labels, of course, that's almost, but it's the kind of stuff that really, makes you want to stay away from these if you ever knew what was in them. And this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. You got you got Snoop Dogg, you got Seth Rogen, Cheech and Chong, Willie Nelson. Edible Arrangements got into the game. And I put these up here. I put these up here.
Fruit's always dry.
Because all of these products, because of our per package and per serving limits, would be illegal in Vermont adult use stores, and yet these are shipped through the mail. These aren't subject to cannabis excise tax. These have, not subject to our advertising restrictions.
Who's the guy in the sweater?
Seth Rogen? Yeah. Frankly, these are probably the more reputable brands because these people, I'm sure, have reputational interests at stake. It's these products that you start seeing in gas stations. And these are the ones that are really kind of scary. These are mimicking popular candies. They're intentionally trying to look like Cheetos and Funyuns or Oreos. You look at this, 500 milligrams of THC in that package. 500 milligrams, like 1,000. We have a 100 milligram per container limit in Vermont. So this is 10 times as much. And we certainly don't allow any products through that product registration product that would look anything like or could be mistaken for a candy or a popular food stuff. Let's see. Okay, well, I think these slides are, for some reason, they seem to be out of sync for some reason. But so in addition to the hemp market, there are just structural challenges. I won't go into great detail. Regulatory compliance costs are extreme. What other, it costs $1,200 to be a tier 1 cultivator in Vermont. What other kind of license? It's basically agriculture would you charge $1,200 for. And that's not even talking about it's about $450 to do a full panel of testing, seed to sale tracking, child resistant packaging, security costs. There are no, federally insured, FDIC insured banks do not, generally speaking, bank cannabis money, and there's certainly no lending. So people are paying exorbitant rates, sometimes $500 a month for purely a depository account, just to park money into. Insurance, there are no admitted insurers, so but we require insurance. Really, like people are walking into these stores, they should really have general liability insurance. So they have to rely on these unlicensed surplus line insurers, unregulated surplus line insurers. they can charge whatever they want and probably, find lots of exclusions to what's actually covered in the fine print. There's no, of course, small business support, no like SBA support for cannabis businesses. And then 280E of the IRS code, I just want to say a few. This has kind of an interesting history to it. So there was a kind of notorious drug trafficker named Jeffrey Edmondson. He was arrested and convicted, and he went to the IRS, tried to, get them money from his illegal profits, and he said, all right, fine, but I'm going to deduct my ordinary expenses, the rent where I was storing my drugs, the scales and the packaging that I used, and the telephone bills and my mileage for my car. And the tax court agreed with him. They said, hey, sure, And so Congress responded the very next year by passing Section 280E of the tax code. And it just said anyone who's trafficking in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 controlled substances cannot take any of the standard business deductions. So that means that this is just a kind of depiction of what it means to be taxed on gross profit, not net income. So on the right, you see what a cannabis business, if they have 200 in revenue, 2 million in revenue, they subtract the cost of goods sold, get to gross profit of 1.4. They have all these expenses that this business can write off. And so their net income is 200,000, but they're taxed on the whole 1.4 million. And so at the end of the year, they're actually in the red, even with 200 million or 2 million in sales. And you just can compare that to a more traditional non-cannabis business or a hemp business for that matter, that's making those kind of intoxicating hemp products. I think it's just important to realize that, these cannabis businesses, even the ones that are successful, are struggling.
Yes, Chair Pepper, why then is there such an increase in the market? I mean, if they're struggling so much, why would they go into this? I mean, to me, they're popping up all the time. So I don't get it, I guess.
Until you really have to grapple with this, I feel like you don't fully understand the consequence of being a 280E business. But I think a lot of the folks that got into our market are people that were growing on the illicit side and really wanted to go legal, wanted to be above board. This is their passion, and they don't want to be kind of under the threat of prosecution. But this is a challenging situation to deal with. I just highlighted, it's difficult. And we've seen a number of license relinquishments. This is a number from 2025. We saw 70 licensees kind of turn in their license. We always do an exit interview with the people when, why aren't you going? And almost always it's cost of regulatory compliance, cost of insurance, cost of banking are the kind of, or market access. Those are the main drivers of the license relinquishments. So there are some federal developments, including as of yesterday, that are quite dramatic. I normally don't have to give this kind of disclaimer, but for anyone watching at home, nothing that I say about this, it's evolving so quickly that it could change tomorrow. And there's a lot of ambiguity about what's the signals that are coming out of the federal government and what the Department of Justice is doing, that no one should take anything that I'm saying and rely on it as either legal advice or tax advice. So rescheduling, the President Trump made some headlines in December saying that he's directing his Attorney General to move cannabis as a plant from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Just as a reminder, Schedule 1 is defined by having no current accepted medical uses. That's the threshold question. And then what's the kind of abuse, the risk profile of it? So marijuana was put as Schedule 1 along with heroin, LSD, ecstasy. Schedule 2 is, hydrocodone, Adderall, methamphetamines. Schedule 3, though, the threshold question is, yes, there is an accepted medical use for Schedule 3. and a moderate to low profile, abuse profile. So like Tylenol, codeine, certain steroids. So we get there's a lot of ambiguity as to what this would mean to the existing cannabis industry. So what we feel confident in saying is that we would remove the applicability of 280E. So it would fix that tax write-off situation for Schedule 3 businesses, because the 280E explicitly applied to Schedule 1, trafficking of Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 substances. It very likely would make it easier to possess cannabis for the purposes of research. Any institution that accepts any sort of federal money or is a 501c3, is tax exempt for some reason, just won't touch cannabis really. I mean, there's a very narrow pathway to possess cannabis, but it's just not realistic for most people, for research purposes, I should say. What it will not do very likely, all the adult use products are not FDA approved regulated drugs. So it's not going to just say that you need to have a prescription to get cannabis, that you need to purchase cannabis at a pharmacy. It doesn't open the doors to interstate commerce of these products. Again, they're not regulated FDA approved drugs. They're still going to be outside of that system. So no interstate commerce. It may signal to banks, it doesn't do anything immediately to fix the banking problem. There is a separate piece of legislation called safe banking that would theoretically fix that. But it may signal to banks that, hey, listen, this is a much less stringently controlled substance. Maybe you should consider banking this. I got to say that even that executive order moving cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 was confusing enough for regulators around the country. And I say that because cannabis is, unlike some of these other substances, cannabis is a botanical that has hundreds of cannabinoids, some known, some unknown. It's this mix of hundreds of compounds that make up the cannabis plant. There's a lot of biodiversity. So moving cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, we have lots of bespoke products that kind of take a little bit of CBG or CBD and, isolate it and put it into this product at different ratios. Does moving 1 to 3 mean that all those products are now legal? What about the ones that are synthesized, the derivatives? Like, are those legal now? So even this executive order left a little bit to, we were, as a regulator agency, asking for clarity from the DEA as to what to do with some of these synthetic and semi-synthetic cannabinoids that are isolated from cannabis. But to make things this is the first time I've had a chance to talk about this because, as you can see, the date was yesterday. Last week, the Attorney General's office just bypassed the whole rescheduling process that's laid out in the Controlled Substance Act and rescheduled through obscure, I don't think it's ever been used before, treaty process that we have with the Uniform Narcotics, the single convention on narcotic drugs. And so with the stroke of the pen, the Attorney General bifurcated cannabis even further than just the cannabis hemp debate, and said that immediately, effective April 28th, certain categories of cannabis are going to be Schedule 3, and then the rest are going to be Schedule 1. So there are 3 approved cannabis-infused, cannabis-based FDA drugs. 2 of them are synthetic cannabis, and 1 of them is CBD. So Marinol, Syndros are the synthetic THCs, and then Epidiolex is the CBD. So that's going to be Schedule 3. And then the part that's just wildly confusing. Products, this is the language from the order. Products subject to state-issued license to manufacture, distribute, or dispense marijuana or products containing marijuana for medical purposes. So what is meant by a state-issued license? We have medical use endorsed adult use retailers. Is that a licensed medical? There's no uniform definition of a medical marijuana product. And honestly, for medical purposes, the definition of Schedule 1 is there's no currently accepted medical uses for cannabis. So what is a medical purpose? There's no uniform definition of what a medical patient is. You know, we have 40 states that have medical programs. Everyone treats patients differently. Some self-certify. You can walk in Washington, DC, you can walk into a cannabis dispensary, say I have a medical condition, and you're a patient. So in a lot of states, they're medical, and just like in Vermont, their medical and adult use are merged. So what does this mean for those types of businesses? There's a lot of nuance that was glossed over in this order. And I don't think, I mean, we've been on kind of like these all state calls, trying to figure out what this means and what clarity we need from the Department of Justice, you know, from the Department of Treasury as to how we treat this.
Do you have any sense like what rules or interpretations, like what the timeline's gonna look like for it?
So
I know that for some other, like, I know that at least for some tax laws, we like haven't received.
yes, so we have no real concept of that. What was in the order is that they're gonna expedite registration with the DEA to become one of these marijuana distributors, like medical marijuana distributors. So they've already opened the portal for this. You can register as a medical marijuana distributor, and you have to submit a bunch of information about your products and your employees and your inventory to the DEA. And theoretically, you might get some 280E relief. That's the kind of carrot that they're dangling out in order to do that. But it's very confusing to know what that even means. Are you like, is it just you're going to be able to write off deductions related to the sales to medical patients, or, you know, it's you know, it's probably best for me to not even talk about it because it's so confusing. And so no one has any real concept of what this means. That being said, the DEA also has scheduled a hearing on June 29th to move all the rest of this products to Schedule 3. So we don't know what that outcome of that hearing is going to be, or how quickly, you know, things might become Schedule 3 after the hearing is concluded, whether there's going to be any sort of legal kind of interference with that. But all that's to say is this is a rapidly evolving situation. So please, you know, anyone who's a cannabis licensee, don't think that we have all the answers at the board quite yet. We're trying to figure this out. The other just piece before I go to the legislation, I see the time and I know that this is kind of a dry subject, but also a shock to everyone. The bill to reopen the government in November of 2026 had a rider on it that systematically closed all of those intoxicating hemp loopholes. It said instead of the 0.3% also it does apply, but there's also going to be a 0.4 milligram per package. So that 150 milligram candy bar can only have now 0.4 milligrams of THC. It can't have the 150. It closed down the THCA loophole, the joint loophole, and it said that any cannabinoids manufactured outside of the cannabis plant are synthetic and are not, you know, hemp. So it very effectively closed those three major loopholes, but it put a 1-year delay on the effective date. As I mentioned, there's a lot of big money interest in seeing this fix changed. And so that 1-year delay, there's no guarantee that this is actually going to be the law. And a lot of the big hemp producing states are advocating to either delay implementation of this even further or change it. Okay, so you have two bills coming your way. S-278, natural and cannabis. This is kind of a reimagining, I would say, of the cannabis industry. It started out as a reimagining of the cannabis industry, you know, just it was kind of why don't we just discuss, debate every cannabis market expansion idea that we've heard in the last 5 years and will whittle it down to what is acceptable to the Senate. And it was 5-0 out of committee, voice vote in favor on the floor. The key provisions are it increases the per package THC limit in cannabis products, currently set at 100. It proposes to raise that to 200. There's a 1 ounce transaction limit currently. So a customer who's checking out of cannabis can only purchase up to 1 ounce of cannabis or its equivalent in cannabis products at a time. This increases that to 2 ounces. It establishes a cannabis event pilot, which has a fee involved. So you guys may want to just think about this fee. This is essentially, it says it's a pilot. The cannabis board can establish rules and procedures and issue up to 20 permits a year, 10 for public events, 10 for private events that can include the sale and consumption of cannabis and cannabis products. The fee is $500. 50% would go to the Cannabis Regulation Fund, which pays our bills. And 50% would go to the municipality that's hosting the event. It also establishes a delivery pilot, a delivery permit for, licensees, either they focused on cultivators and manufacturers can get a authorization to do deliveries to, physical addresses. It proposes to reduce outdoor cultivation fees by half. However, the Appropriations Committee put a little contingency on that in a floor amendment, saying only if we actually appropriate the money to pay for this, which they did not do. So I don't know what that is going to mean. We'll see. So it expands the municipal authority over certain cannabis establishments, just giving the kind of full gamut of bylaws and ordinances so that municipalities can, regulate the kind of location and time, place, manner of cannabis establishments. It included expanded access to business support. Authorizes the governor to negotiate or execute interstate commerce compacts. We discussed that earlier. And then it precludes landlords from prohibiting consumption of non-lit cannabis products in a residential lease agreement. The other one that I needed to mention is the hemp portion of the miscellaneous agricultural bill. So this one, because of that federal change, is very up in the air as to how this is going to turn out. Everything kind of hinges on what happens in November. But I can just rewind a little bit. The Agency of Agriculture used to regulate hemp cultivators and hemp processors. They stopped doing that in 2022, leaving these folks without a regulatory home. Meanwhile, you see all the kind of explosion of hemp-infused products. Well, these people are operating in Vermont. They're making these products, but when they try and get business insurance or get a bank account or enter into agreements with distributors, they run into some serious problems that they're handling cannabinoids. Are they marijuana or are they hemp? And so they have been requesting from legislators, including the chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee, that they want a regulatory home. They need someone in the state that has some visibility over their operations to ensure that they are purely hemp processors and not cannabis. So they don't have to worry about 280E. They don't have to worry about surplus line insurance. They don't have to worry about increased banking costs, et cetera. So what this does is it shifts the existing statutory authority from the Agency of Agriculture to the CCB, and it authorizes the same kind of traditional rulemaking with a lighter touch on the kind of hemp processing, the licensing, the testing, labeling, types of additives that can go into a hemp product. And then it establishes these 3 fees that are up on the board. And then because we really don't know whether after November, the hemp industry is going to be purely intrastate like the cannabis market is, because the products they're producing would be illegal for interstate commerce, or whether those kind of Snoop Dogg and Seth Rogen products, edible arrangements, are still going to be able to be shipped into Vermont. it allows us to define what a craft processor is and waive regulations, waive fees for those craft processors. So for instance, if this was an interstate market where we have the big players involved in Vermont, if you have access to our market, you know, a company with, 50 employees, it's Vermont based, although it doesn't matter that it's Vermont based for the purposes of the Dormant Commerce Clause, but might be considered craft compared to, Willie Nelson with, his 1,000 employees.
Is the idea that the waiving of that $75 or $500 fee is going to make the difference in their battle with the edible arrangements?
Awesome. So the idea is that this allows us to, after November, and we know whether this hemp law is going to go into effect or not, and not kind of adjust the kind of scope and scale of the regulations, depending on whether we're dealing with large multinational corporations or just a local Vermont craft maker. So I think that's it.
Well done, Pepper.
Question, it seems like there's a lot coming up across the country regarding hallucinogenics. And I'm just wondering if you've heard any rumblings or if that's something the Cannabis Control Board would take on as well. It looks to me like there's a few states that have done it for municipal purposes, medicinal purposes. I don't know, have you heard?
I think that there's a working group on this and they're considering doing it at the Department of Health. But there is a psychedelics division at the Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division. So it's one of these things when you're kind of moving something off the schedule and saying it's legal in the state, but it's federally illegal, you got to put it somewhere. And the Cannabis Board is an attractive place to put it because we don't accept any federal money. So there's no worry that it's going to draw the attention of the federal government. But I think we're just politically just a ways away from doing that. So just because I don't think the working group has made recommendations, or if they have, I don't know.
Yeah, Representative Brennan.
Went through a ton of information fairly quickly, so it took more than an hour, but thank you for sharing all this. I wasn't really clear on regarding the medical use of cannabis, if there's any health insurance to cover that cost. No.
No, interestingly, if that's a good word to use here, that Trump executive order about rescheduling also suggested that CMS, Medicaid, cover up to $500 worth of CBD products.
Okay.
And so Dr. Oz released some kind of guidance on how to do that. I don't know if it's effect or not, but it's not around cannabis products. It's around CBD products.
I've said this before to the committee, but in my opinion, I think it's an act of mercy to allow these folks who are sick with chemo or whatever to make use of this product. It really does help.
It absolutely does. The federal government under the Biden administration, when they proposed rescheduling to Schedule III, they were in a catch-22 because all of the evidence you would need to present to the Department of Justice to suggest that something should be lowered in the schedule, they were prohibited from accessing because it's Schedule I. You can't research cannabis in order to have the type of information that you need to show that it has a therapeutic use or medical application. But so they had to actually change the analysis for the Department of Justice, and they moved from a 5-factor analysis to a 2-factor analysis. And they just said, listen, we have 6 million registered patients around the country. We have 40 states with adult use programs. We have over 30,000 physicians who are qualified to sign off on medical cards. And they found that the kind of general consensus is that cannabis is an effective treatment for pain and for appetite stimulation for people that are going through chemotherapy and nausea. Right, exactly.
Right. I know that in Vermont, for patients who are suffering from those, especially initiated by chemotherapy, they are able to find some.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes family members to help, to take it down.
Yes, yeah.
It's just that they have to pay for it. It's for some, that's a problem.
Yeah, and that I think was really the motivation behind the medical use endorsement, because what it felt like to the legislature, and we were kind of presenting evidence, is the patients are not being held harmless. They are losing their access to products and services with the advent of adult use. And so you guys stepped in, and we're actually, I did have a slide on it, disappeared somehow. We're actually seeing an increase in the number of patients for the first time since 2017, so.
One question on hemp manufacturers and the cultivators, hemp cultivators. Because I remember when that came through the legislature because it wasn't really permissible even for hemp manufacturers at that point. So I'm wondering if they're formally regulated by the Agency of Agriculture, Farms and Markets, or?
Just the growers?
Yeah,
So the growers themselves, the agency sent their regulation to USDA. And it's going to stay at USDA. What we're more concerned about are not the people that are actually getting their hands in the soil.
Yeah.
They're taking that cannabis, converting it into the distillate,
okay.
and then pumping it into products. Because that's the real like rub here. That's the part of the supply chain where there's no regulation.
So that's who those license fees are intended.
That's right.
Growers for the.
Right,
Okay.
and you saw that there was a grower fee of $50. It's really because for a large stage of the growth cycle of a plant, hemp and cannabis are indistinguishable from one another. And so we need to just have some ability to distinguish them. So that $50 fee is really, if you look at what the authorization in rulemaking is for that, it's just for us to be able to go on and test the plants to make sure that they're actually hemp and not cannabis.
Thank you so
Yes.
much for your time today. That was so delightfully thorough and enjoyable.
Thank you. And if there's any, I mean, james.pepper@vermont.gov, if there's ever any follow-up questions.
Thank you. We're going to take a very brief stretch break, folks, and then be back here in 5 minutes to talk about